People often think that when they strip away your last remaining dollars, they can push a human being to the very brink of death. They believe the cold asphalt and the crushing weight of destitution will shatter a human spirit into unrecoverable pieces. But they do not know that when they strip away every single protective layer of comfort, that is precisely when the roots of ancient weathered trees pierce the absolute deepest to touch a grand, unstoppable underground current. The air inside the Oak Haven County nursing home was sterile, thick, and suffocating. Silas Thorne sat perfectly still on the edge of the narrow mattress. He was 76 years old. His broad shoulders, forged by decades of shaping heavy timber and bending thick steel as a shipyard engineer, remained unbowed. Beside him sat Clara, his wife of 52 years, her 73-year-old hands resting quietly in her lap. Her joints were swollen from severe arthritis, every slight movement a quiet agony she bore with profound dignity. The facility administrator stood in the doorway, tapping his polished leather shoes against the cold linoleum floor. He held a single sheet of crisp white paper, an eviction notice. The words were typed in harsh, unforgiving black ink, detailing exactly 3 months of unpaid residential fees. The administrator offered a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach his cold eyes, waiting for the inevitable breakdown, the weeping, or the desperate pleas for mercy. He waited in vain. Silas did not scream, he did not curse the heavens, nor did he beg for a few more days of grace. He simply reached out with his large, heavily calloused hand and took the paper. His failing eyesight scanned the lines, absorbing the absolute reality of their ruin. The betrayal tasted like dry ash in his mouth. Julian, their 48-year-old son, the boy they had poured 52 years of their youth, their sweat, and their blood into. Silas and Clara had lived on cheap canned soup, wearing threadbare coats and walking miles in the freezing rain to save a few pennies, just to ensure Julian never lacked a single thing. And Julian had repaid them with flawless, calculating precision. 2 years ago, when Silas's vision began to fail and Clara's legs could barely carry her up a flight of stairs, Julian arrived. He wore expensive cologne and a mask of deep, manufactured concern. He spoke in gentle, soothing tones, convincing them that the world was too fast, too complex for them to handle anymore. He placed a legal document on the table, a comprehensive power of attorney, and handed his father a pen. Silas had signed it with a father's absolute trust. Julian had systematically drained every single cent. $65,000, their entire life savings, gathered over thousands of agonizing hours of labor, was wiped out in a matter of weeks. He used their blood money to cover his own reckless deaths, severed all communication, and simply vanished into the wind. He left the two frail old people to face the clinical humiliation of being cast out onto the street. "It is time to go, Clara," Silas murmured gently, his voice a deep, steady rumble. He turned away from the administrator. He methodically packed their entire existence. He folded faded cotton shirts, worn wool sweaters, heavy leather boots, and a few framed photographs, placing them carefully into 2 scuffed leather suitcases. It was a meager, heartbreaking pile. He lifted the 50 pounds of luggage. Silas walked out of that room with his spine perfectly straight. He offered his arm to Clara. She took it, her chin held high, her face mask of serene, unbreakable endurance. They walked down the brightly lit corridor, past the whispering nurses and the staring residents, moving with the quiet, overwhelming majesty of ancient royalty descending from a ruined throne. They did not look back. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them. Outside, the brutal South Carolina heat hit them like a physical blow, the temperature hovering near 98 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with the scent of distant marshlands. Silas guided Clara across the blistered asphalt to the far edge of the parking lot where their last remaining possession sat waiting. A rusted 1998 Buick. Its paint was peeling, its steel frame sagged slightly on the left side, yet it was their absolute only refuge. Silas settled Clara into the passenger seat, his rough fingers brushing a strand of gray hair from her sweating forehead. He walked around, climbed into the driver's seat, and closed the heavy steel door. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. He reached into the deep pocket of his faded canvas trousers and pulled out a crumpled wad of paper money. He flattened the bills against his knee. A 10, a 5, and 4 singles. $19. That was the entirety of their financial worth in the world. 19 pathetic, crumpled dollars standing between them and absolute starvation. He looked at the money. He looked at his wife. He did not shed a single tear. Instead, his jaw set into a line of pure, hardened steel. Huddled in that suffocating, rusted car under the fading light, Silas stared out at the sprawling highway, completely unaware of the monumental shift approaching in the universe. He did not know that precisely at this moment of absolute rock bottom, a sudden sharp memory from a quarter century ago was about to flash across the darkness of his mind, handing him the key to tear open a forgotten empire.
The interior of the 1998 Buick became a suffocating oven. The South Carolina sun beat down relentlessly onto the cracked dashboard, pushing the temperature well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cramped metal cabin. Silas and Clara spent 3 agonizing nights coiled on the sagging upholstery, their bodies aching from the unnatural angles, their skin slick with unending sweat. The heat was an oppressive, invisible weight pressing down on their chests, making every single breath a conscious, grueling effort. They did not complain. They shared a single stale egg sandwich wrapped in cheap wax paper, Silas firmly insisting Clara take the larger portion. He watched in heavy, helpless silence as she carefully cut her remaining heart medication in half, swallowing the tiny white fragment without a single drop of water to make the meager supply last just a few days longer. The brutal reality of their absolute poverty was a crushing physical weight that threatened to snap their bones. Then, in the dead of the 4th night, a sharp memory pierced the stifling dark. A forgotten metal storage unit on the outskirts of the county, a small rusting box they had rented decades ago to hold old family documents, the rent automatically deducted from a closed bank account until it had undoubtedly gone into default. Silas turned the ignition. The engine choked, sputtered violently, and finally roared to life. The storage facility clerk was a young, overweight man with grease-stained fingers and a look of absolute, undisguised contempt. He sneered at the old man's worn canvas trousers, the heavy boots scuffed white with age, and the exhausted woman leaning heavily against the cinder-block wall, a portrait of complete defeat that clearly amused him. "You are 3 years late, old man," the clerk mocked lazily. "Pay the $12 in late fees right now, or I toss the whole lot in the dumpster." Silas did not flinch. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his crumpled bills. He methodically peeled away a 10 and 2 singles, sliding the $12 across the scratched laminate counter. He now possessed exactly $7 to his name. The clerk snatched the money with a heavy scoff and tossed a rusted brass key onto the desk. The air inside unit number 42 smelled intensely of dry dust and rotting cardboard. Silas stepped into the gloom, his eyes scanning the forgotten relics of a lifetime. In the very back corner, hidden beneath a heavy steel filing cabinet, the metal drawer groaned in sharp protest as he pulled it open. He bypassed the old tax returns, the faded utility bills, the crumbling black and white photographs of forgotten relatives, and the rusted mechanical tools he had once used in the shipyards, his rough fingers reaching the absolute bottom. He pulled out a heavy, yellowed parchment dated 1999. It was a legal property deed, 12 acres of untamed marshland and dense coastal forest on Blackwater Island, legally transferred to Silas Thorne by his eccentric, long-deceased uncle Bartholomew. Attached was a formal bank notice confirming that all property taxes had been quietly, automatically paid in full for 25 years by an anonymous trust. The island was notoriously isolated, shrouded in thick hanging moss, and entirely avoided by the locals who constantly whispered dark tales of a lingering curse. Silas stared at the paper. He guided Clara back into the Buick and drove straight to the crumbling wooden docks of the Oakhaven waterfront. The salt air was thick and biting. He found Amos, a 60-year-old fisherman with a face like weathered leather, sitting on the deck of a battered trawler. "Take us to Blackwater," Silas said calmly. Amos spat into the dark water, his eyes widening in genuine fearful disbelief. "Nobody goes to that cursed rock, Silas. It's a death trap of deep sinkholes and venomous copperhead snakes." "I have exactly $7, Silas stated flatly, holding out the absolute last of his money. "Take us." Amos looked at the frail, dignified woman standing quietly behind the giant of a man. He took the $7 with a heavy sigh and fired up the rattling diesel engine. The boat ride was a silent, turbulent journey across choppy gray waters, the wind whipping violently against their faces. The dark water slapped aggressively against the wooden hull, spraying freezing salt on their worn clothes. Yet Silas stood perfectly straight at the bow, like a seasoned captain navigating his final storm. When the rusted bow finally bumped against the muddy, overgrown shoreline of the island, Silas stepped off first. He carefully helped Clara down onto the unstable earth. Amos did not turn off his engine. "May God have mercy on you both," Amos muttered grimly. The trawler pulled away immediately, leaving them entirely alone at the edge of the world. The isolation was absolute. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and ancient mud. Silas turned his back to the retreating boat. He stepped forward, his calloused hands gripping a thick, thorny vine blocking their path. He ripped it away with a sudden, violent surge of hidden strength. The fog parted slowly. Through the dense gray mist, a massive, dark silhouette suddenly emerged, towering silently against the sky, unyielding to the salt wind and defying every single rule of this forsaken wasteland.
The thorny vines tore violently at his faded canvas trousers, but Silas pushed forward with the heavy, rhythmic steps of a man who had spent a lifetime conquering unyielding materials. He led Clara through the dense, tangled underbrush of the 12-acre island, stepping over rotting oak logs, thick cypress roots, and deep pools of stagnant, mosquito-infested water. The air was incredibly thick. The humidity clung to their skin like a wet wool blanket, the afternoon temperature still hovering near 95 degrees Fahrenheit. They expected to find a collapsed wooden shack, a rotting pile of forgotten timber, or perhaps nothing at all. They stopped dead in their tracks. Rising from the center of the overgrown clearing was not a ruin, it was a fortress. A massive two-story classical mansion stood silently in the mist, built entirely of thick, weathered cypress wood. Silas stared at the structure, his pale eyes narrowing as the mind of a master shipbuilder automatically calculated angles, load-bearing joints, and aerodynamic curves. The house was an absolute masterpiece of survival engineering. The roof was pitched at a sharp 45-degree angle to violently deflect hurricane-force winds. The foundation was elevated on 12-inch thick timber pilings driven deep into the bedrock, lifting the floorboards a full 6 feet above the highest possible flood lines. The heavy wooden shutters were bolted with thick iron hinges, completely sealing the glass windows from flying debris. It was perfectly intact. Silas let go of Clara's hand for a moment. He walked slowly toward the wide front porch, his heavy boots echoing softly against the solid wood stairs. He remembered the eccentric, brilliant mind of his late uncle Bartholomew. The man trusted no banks, no governments, and absolutely no modern security systems. Silas knelt carefully on the dusty planks. He counted the heavy field stones lining the base of the porch steps. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at the fourth stone. He wedged his calloused fingers into the dry dirt beneath the heavy rock and pulled. The stone shifted with a heavy, grinding scrape. Beneath it lay a small, oiled leather pouch. He opened it, his rough thumb brushing against cold, heavy metal. A solid brass key. He stood up, walking to the massive front door, and slid the key into the rusted iron lock. It turned with a sharp, satisfying click. Silas pushed the heavy door open, stepping into a world that had been frozen in absolute silence for exactly 25 years. The air inside was stale, but completely dry. Silas and Clara walked through the grand hallway, their footsteps raising tiny clouds of gray dust. The interior framework of the house was meticulously preserved. Exposed oak beams, thick as a man's torso, supported the vaulted ceilings. Silas walked into the kitchen and found a manual water pump connected to a massive 500-gallon galvanized steel catchment cistern. He pressed the iron handle down. With a heavy groan, a stream of clear, perfectly filtered rainwater poured into the dusty porcelain sink. "We have water," Silas said quietly, his voice steady and low. Clara moved slowly toward the heavy oak pantry doors. She pulled them open. Lined up in immaculate military-style rows were dozens of sealed glass jars, thick metal tin cans, heavy bags of white rice, vacuum-sealed pouches of dried fruit, and massive glass jars of raw honey. There was enough food to sustain 2 people for several years. Silas looked out the back window and noticed 3 large, older-generation solar panels securely mounted on a sturdy wooden rack, heavily wired to a bank of deep-cycle marine batteries in the corner of the room. A small green light blinked faintly on the charge controller. They were not going to starve. They were going to survive. Silas left Clara in the kitchen to rest her aching joints. He walked down the narrow, shadowy hallway, pushing open a solid oak door at the very end. It was a private study. The room smelled heavily of old paper, dried leather, and stale pipe tobacco. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by towering bookshelves filled with maritime law volumes and engineering texts. Silas approached the desk, wiping away a thick layer of dust with his bare hand. Lying perfectly center on the desk was a large, hand-drawn map of Blackwater Island. Beside the map rested a thick, leather-bound maritime salvage logbook. Silas opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with Uncle Bartholomew's sharp, meticulous handwriting, detailing decades of legal deep-water shipwreck recoveries, maritime law loopholes, salvage rights, and geographic ocean coordinates. Silas flipped through the heavy pages, his eyes scanning the endless lists of oceanic depths, weather patterns, and ancient cargo manifests. Then he saw it. A single page folded carefully in half. Silas opened the paper, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. It was a detailed architectural diagram of a hidden subterranean chamber. The precise notes indicated an artificial vault carved directly into the sheer, jagged rocks of the island's north cliffs, where the land dropped a terrifying 50 feet straight down into the crashing sea. The coordinates were exact. He read the final line of text, written in heavy black ink. The entrance to the vault was submerged entirely underwater, completely invisible from land or sea, hidden behind a massive shelf of coral and stone. It would only be exposed during the absolute lowest phase of the lunar tide, when the ocean pulled back nearly 200 yards from the jagged shoreline. He stared at the faded ink. Today was the lowest tide of the entire month. He looked out the dusty study window toward the violent, crashing waves of the north shore, his mind calculating the impossible weight of the physical task ahead. The Cypress mansion was an absolute masterpiece of survival, a brilliant sanctuary designed by a paranoid genius to keep them alive against the wrath of nature. But to shatter the time-sealed lock on that submerged vault, Silas prepared to drain the absolute last drops of sweat from his 76-year-old body.
Silas walked out to the rotting wooden shed behind the massive Cypress house. He found a rusted steel machete, a heavy iron crowbar, a canvas bag of tarnished wrenches, and a glass bottle of dark machine oil covered in thick spider webs. He picked up the heavy tools. The air was a suffocating blanket of moisture, pushing the heat index to nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not pause to wipe the sweat from his brow. He began to clear the choked yard. He swung the heavy steel blade. The machete sliced through thick green vines, tangled briars, rotting palm fronds, and invasive swamp weed that had swallowed the property for exactly 25 years. Every swing was a calculated, precise transfer of kinetic energy from his worn shoulders, down his aching back, through his heavily calloused palms, and straight into the rusted steel. The brutal South Carolina sun showed absolute no mercy. The heat radiated from the damp earth in visible, shimmering waves. Silas chopped down a massive 10-foot-tall palmetto bush that had grown directly over the main water lines. The thick, fibrous trunk resisted his dull machete, forcing him to hack at the base over 40 times. His breathing grew ragged. His chest heaved heavily against his soaked canvas shirt. Yet his mind was completely calm. He calculated the exact angle of his strikes, finding the weak points in the dense wood, using simple physics and leverage rather than blind rage. His 76-year-old muscles burned with a fierce, quiet agony. Sweat poured down his weathered face, soaking his collar, stinging his failing eyes, and dripping continuously onto the baked soil. He did not utter a single complaint. This was the work of a man who possessed immense dignity. He was not a victim crying over stolen money. He was a creator, a builder, a man who understood that true survival required immense, silent sacrifice. Inside the house, Clara worked with equal, unbreakable resolve. Her swollen, arthritic fingers gripped a stiff wooden brush, scrubbing away decades of thick gray dust, dead insects, dry leaves, and hardened grime from the heavy oak floorboards. Every movement sent sharp electric shocks of pain up her arms. She ignored the pain completely. She moved to the massive oak dining table, using a heavy damp cloth to wipe away the thick layer of grime, revealing the beautiful, rich grain of the antique wood beneath. She found a set of heavy cast iron skillets in the lower cabinet, carrying them to the sink to scrub them clean. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. Her knuckles turned bruised and purple from the massive effort. They were not victims waiting to die, but survivors reclaiming their absolute dignity from the ashes of betrayal. She thought of Julian, of his soft hands, his expensive manicures, his cowardly lies, and the $65,000 he had stolen to fuel his hollow, pathetic life. She scrubbed harder. By noon, Silas moved to the rusted diesel generator sitting beneath a heavy canvas tarp on the side porch. He stripped the machine down with absolute surgical precision. He used a stiff wire brush to scrape thick red rust from the spark plugs, unbolted the clogged fuel lines, drained the foul sludge that used to be gasoline, and carefully poured in fresh oil he found sealed in a glass jar in the pantry. His large hands were stained completely black with ancient grease, dirt, and dried blood from numerous deep thorn cuts. These were the hands of a builder. They were the absolute opposite of the greedy, manicured fingers that had coldly signed the forged power of attorney. Silas wrapped a frayed nylon cord around the heavy metal flywheel. He braced his leather boots against the solid wood deck. He pulled the cord with a violent, explosive surge of raw power. The engine coughed heavily. He pulled it again. The heavy machine sputtered, violently shook off 25 years of deep sleep, and roared into a steady, deafening hum. Inside the house, 3 dusty glass bulbs flickered weakly before blooming into solid, warm yellow light. Clara stepped onto the porch. "It runs," she said softly, a deep pride in her voice. "It always does," Silas replied evenly. He wiped his blackened hands on a filthy cotton rag. He looked up at the sky. The blazing afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the swamp. He pulled the heavy iron crowbar from his canvas bag. He reached into his deep pocket, feeling the cold, smooth edges of the second brass key he had found, tucked inside Uncle Bartholomew's journal. It was time. The trek to the north shore was a grueling, agonizing march through half a mile of dense coastal jungle. Silas navigated through towering oak trees draped in thick Spanish moss, stepped over deep sinkholes hidden by dead ferns, and pushed through walls of sharp palmetto leaves that cut thin, bleeding lines across his thick forearms. The temperature dropped slightly, but the oppressive humidity remained an absolute suffocating force. He walked with the slow, relentless pace of a marching soldier. He finally reached the cliff edge. The view was magnificent and terrifying. The land dropped a sheer 50 feet straight down to a jagged shoreline of black volcanic rock and razor-sharp coral reefs. The smell of rotting sea kelp and raw salt hit him like a physical blow. He looked down at the dark, churning water. The ocean was retreating. It was the lowest tide of the entire month. The water pulled back violently, receding 10 yards, then 50 yards, then a full 200 yards away from the base of the massive stone cliffs. The sea exposed a hidden alien landscape of deep tide pools, dead coral heads, tangled seaweed, and massive barnacle-encrusted boulders that had not seen the sunlight in years. Silas found a narrow, treacherous goat path winding down the sheer face of the cliff. He began the descent. The climb down took a full, grueling hour. Silas carefully tested every single rocky foothold before transferring his heavy weight. The salt spray coated his glasses, forcing him to peer over the plastic rims. The jagged rocks sliced through the thick sides of his old leather boots, but he completely ignored the stinging pain. When he finally reached the ocean floor, he stood completely still for a moment, letting his racing heart settle. The mud was deep, foul, and treacherous. It smelled heavily of decaying fish, stagnant sulfur, and ancient brine. He pushed his legs forward. The deep mud pulled at his boots with a sickening, sucking grip, demanding a massive expenditure of energy for every single step. He walked parallel to the towering rock wall, scanning the natural fissures, the dark crevices, and the dense patches of green seagrass. According to the eccentric architect's hand-drawn map, the entrance was hidden perfectly between 2 massive pillars of fossilized coral. He saw them. 2 towering spires of rock leaned against each other, forming a dark, narrow, triangular shadow. Silas squeezed his large frame between the jagged stones, the sharp barnacles tearing at his wet clothing. He stepped into the damp, lightless crevice. He reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy steel flashlight, clicking the thick rubber button. A beam of pale light pierced the darkness.
At the very back of the deep fissure, perfectly integrated into the solid stone wall, stood a massive, heavy iron door. It was completely covered in dark green algae, thick barnacles, and hardened layers of marine calcium. It looked exactly like the sealed bulkhead of a sunken battleship. Silas stepped up to the door. He ran his calloused fingers over the rough, encrusted surface until he found a small, circular indentation. He pulled his rusted steel machete from his belt and began to violently chip away the hardened barnacles. He struck the metal again and again, sending sharp fragments of white shell flying into the dark, damp air. His heavy breaths echoed loudly in the confined space. His massive arms felt like absolute lead. He struck the door until a solid brass keyhole was finally exposed. He inserted the second key. The lock was incredibly stiff, frozen by a quarter of a century of salt and brutal ocean water.
Silas wrapped his thick, bruised fingers around the small piece of brass. He closed his eyes. He summoned the absolute last remaining drops of strength from a lifetime of back-breaking labor, from the 52 years of sacrificing his own comfort, and from the deep, burning core of absolute betrayal inflicted by his own flesh and blood. He twisted his wrist. The heavy internal tumbler snapped open with a sharp, violent click. But the heavy iron door did not move. The exterior hinges were entirely fused with solid rust and marine growth. Silas wedged the flat edge of his heavy iron crowbar into the microscopic seam between the solid door and the stone frame. He planted his heavy boots deep into the slippery mud. He threw his entire body weight backward, pulling the heavy steel lever with every ounce of physical power his aged body could generate. The metal groaned. He pulled harder. He did not curse, he did not cry out, he merely ground his teeth together until his jaw ached, absolutely refusing to let the cold iron defeat him. His muscles screamed for relief. The veins in his thick neck bulged violently. The heavy crowbar began to bend slightly under the impossible pressure. He wedged his shoulder directly against the freezing wet metal of the massive door, pushing with his heavy legs. His boots slid in the mud. He found a solid rock beneath the sludge, planted his heel, and shoved with a brutal, silent surge of sheer willpower. The iron cracked. A shower of red rust and white calcium cascaded down onto his boots. Silas shifted his grip, sliding the crowbar higher, and threw his weight into the lever once more. The iron surrendered. The heavy door blasted open. It moved with a deafening metallic screech that tore through the absolute silence of the subterranean cave, a harsh, violent sound of a tomb being ripped open forcefully. A rush of cold, perfectly dry, chemically treated air hit his sweating face, carrying the faint, distinct scent of oiled canvas, dried wood, and ancient paper. Silas stood frozen in the mud. He raised the heavy flashlight. The beam of pale white light cut through the dense darkness, sweeping slowly across the vast interior of the hidden chamber, illuminating the sheer scale of the impossible architecture. His breath hitched violently. The light hit the far wall. He lowered the flashlight. The heavy hinges stopped screaming, the heavy iron door settled into the mud, and under the dim, flickering beam of light, the heart of the stoic, unbreakable old engineer suddenly stopped dead in his chest before the most absolutely absurd sight in the entire world.
The beam of pale light swept slowly across the cavern. It was not a natural cave formed by the ocean. It was a massive, subterranean fortress carved directly into the living rock, measuring a full 60 feet wide and 40 feet deep. Thick steel beams supported the reinforced concrete ceiling. A complex network of heavy copper pipes and industrial dehumidifiers lined the walls, an absolute marvel of climate-controlled engineering hidden perfectly beneath millions of tons of crushing salt water. The floor was perfectly dry. Stacked in the center of the room, arranged with meticulous military precision, were 3 massive maritime shipping containers. They were cast from thick, corrosion-resistant steel, painted a dull olive green, and sealed with heavy brass pressure latches. Silas stepped over the threshold. His wet leather boots left dark prints on the immaculate gray concrete. He walked slowly toward the first container, the heavy iron crowbar hanging loosely from his right hand. He approached the massive brass latches. They were thick, industrial grade, and completely coated in a thin layer of protective marine grease. He raised the iron bar. He wedged the flat tip under the first heavy latch and threw his tired weight down. The brass snapped open with a sharp, violent sound like a fired gunshot. He moved methodically to the second latch, then the third, his breathing perfectly steady, his mind incredibly focused on the immediate physical task.
He dropped the crowbar. He placed both calloused hands under the heavy steel lid and pushed upward with his aching shoulders. The internal hydraulic hinges hissed softly, perfectly preserved by the dry subterranean air, lifting the massive metal lid with effortless, silent grace. Silas pointed his flashlight inside. He stopped breathing. Packed tightly inside the container, resting on pristine beds of oiled canvas, were hundreds of heavy wooden crates, rows of sealed iron lockboxes, and towering stacks of water-resistant leather bags. Silas reached his rough hand into the nearest open wooden crate, his thick fingers brushing against something cold, heavy, and distinctively metallic. He pulled a handful of the objects out into the pale light. Solid gold, thousands upon thousands of perfectly preserved, incredibly heavy gold coins. They were 18th century Spanish doubloons, stamped with the proud crests of forgotten kings, their surfaces gleaming with a dull, mesmerizing yellow fire that utterly defied the passage of centuries. Beside the crates of gold were deep velvet boxes overflowing with royal jewelry, heavy platinum necklaces choked with flawless white diamonds, thick gold rings set with blood-red rubies the size of quail eggs, and ancient emerald pendants carved into intricate coats of arms. Tucked securely behind the heavy jewels were thick, waterproof document tubes filled with perfectly preserved bearer bonds, the untraceable financial instruments of ghosts. It was a hoard of unimaginable magnitude. He did not gasp. He did not weep. Silas Thorne simply lowered the gold coins back into the wooden crate, his mind coldly processing the absolute staggering reality of the situation. He noticed a small, heavy oak pedestal standing next to the first steel container. Resting precisely on top was a thick black leather ledger. He walked over and opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with the exact same sharp, meticulous handwriting he had studied in the house. It was a letter. "To the blood who holds the deed," Silas read quietly, his deep voice a low rumble in the silent vault. The document detailed a massive, entirely legal ocean salvage operation spanning 2 grueling decades. Uncle Bartholomew had located and legally claimed 3 lost galleons deep within international waters, pulling the ancient treasures from the crushing black depths of the Atlantic. But the massive discovery had triggered a silent, brutal war. Shadowy underworld organizations and ruthless global insurance syndicates had violently threatened his life, attempting to steal the absolute legal rights to the historical fortune. Bartholomew had vanished with the gold. He had built this impossible vault, buried the treasure beneath the crashing sea, and waited patiently for time to do its relentless work. The statute of limitations on international maritime salvage disputes was exactly 25 years. The time had completely expired. "This property legally belongs to any family member holding the deed," the ledger continued, the black ink bold and unyielding. "I hid it here to wait for a worthy person, someone who would not immediately sell the island, someone who would not run from the brutal hardship, and someone who possessed the absolute physical grit to unlock the stone. If you are reading this, you have earned it all." Silas turned the heavy parchment page. The final sheet contained a meticulous, handwritten, itemized inventory of every single coin, jewel, and paper bond secured inside the 3 steel containers. At the very bottom of the page, Bartholomew had calculated the total estimated value of the entire collection: $683 million. Silas stared at the massive number written in faded ink. $683 million. It was an impossible sum of money, a force of nature that could buy entire cities, casually topple governments, and absolutely rewrite the fundamental laws of reality. A few hours ago, he was a broken, discarded old man possessing exactly $19, sleeping in a rusted 1998 Buick, thrown away like useless garbage by a greedy, pathetic son. Now, he was an absolute titan. He slowly closed the heavy leather ledger. The profound, terrifying genius of his late uncle hit him with the massive force of a physical blow. Bartholomew had weaponized time, patience, and absolute secrecy, weaving a flawless masterpiece of legal protection. Silas looked down on his own trembling hands. They were deeply bruised, cut by sharp rocks, and stained with dark black grease. They were the tough hands of a laborer, the quiet hands of a stoic survivor, and now the hands of a man holding the ultimate key to absolute retribution. He turned off the heavy flashlight. He stood alone in the perfect quiet darkness of the immense vault for a very long time. He knew exactly what he had to do next. Holding this massive amount of raw historical wealth was incredibly dangerous, a brilliant beacon that would instantly attract corporate predators far worse than his treacherous son. To transform these heavy gold coins and ancient jewels into unassailable absolute legal power, he could not simply walk blindly into a modern bank. He needed an impenetrable shield. He needed a brilliant, entirely incorruptible legal mind.
Silas ascended the treacherous cliff face with the slow, methodical rhythm of a machine. He returned to the heavy Cypress mansion, walking straight to the dusty communication console in the corner of the study. He fired up the rusted marine radio, his calloused fingers tuning the heavy plastic dials until he caught the static-filled channel used by the local fishermen. He keyed the heavy microphone. "Amos, this is Silas Thorne," he spoke with absolute calm. "Send a secure message to Beatrice Vance in Charleston. Tell her Clara needs her sharpest legal mind immediately." 3 days later, a sleek black private charter boat cut through the deep morning fog. It docked against the rotting wooden piers of Blackwater Island. Beatrice Vance stepped off the deck. She was 65 years old, possessing the sharp, unyielding posture of a woman who had spent 40 decades dismantling predatory maritime insurance conglomerates. She wore a tailored wool suit, despite the 85-degree Fahrenheit heat, her sharp eyes softening with deep affection as she warmly embraced her old friend Clara. Behind her walked 3 nervous men carrying heavy aluminum briefcases. They were elite, independent historical appraisers. Silas led them straight into the swamp. When the ocean pulled back 200 yards during the afternoon tide, the group descended the sheer 50-foot cliff. They entered the climate-controlled vault in absolute stunned silence. The senior appraiser, a man who had spent his entire life cataloging global museum acquisitions, physically trembled as Silas casually opened the heavy steel containers with his bare, bruised hands. The meticulous process began. For 6 grueling hours, the experts frantically examined the heavy 18th-century Spanish doubloons, the flawless white diamonds set in thick royal platinum, the massive emerald pendants carved with ancient coats of arms, and the thick stacks of perfectly preserved bearer bonds. They weighed the solid gold in heavy pounds. They heavily scrutinized every single historical hallmark, royal stamp, and faded watermark under intense artificial light. The air in the subterranean chamber grew incredibly thick with unspoken tension. The senior appraiser finally closed his heavy leather notebook. He looked at Silas. His face was pale, completely drained of blood. "The original estimate was incredibly conservative," the appraiser whispered with deep, shaking reverence.
Adjusting for the massive current market demand for uncirculated colonial gold, the sheer historical provenance of the royal jewels, and the inflation over the last 25 years, the total is staggering. He took a slow, heavy breath. $750 million. The massive number hung in the cold, dry air. It was a force of absolute gravity. Silas stood perfectly still, his weathered face showing absolutely no emotion, his broad shoulders relaxed. Clara merely closed her eyes and let out a long, quiet breath. Beatrice stepped forward. She pulled a thick stack of legal documents from her leather briefcase, spreading the crisp white papers across the heavy steel lid of the first container. I have thoroughly cross-referenced the property deed, the international salvage statutes, and the 25-year expiration clause, Beatrice stated with absolute terrifying legal authority. The original claims by the underworld syndicates have completely evaporated under the strict statute of limitations. There are absolutely no loopholes, no hidden federal taxes, and no contesting parties. She handed Silas a heavy gold pen. This entire fortune belongs legally, entirely, and permanently to you and Clara, she confirmed warmly. Silas signed the final trust document. From two discarded, homeless elders possessing exactly 19 crumpled dollars and sleeping in a 1998 Buick, they had silently transformed into absolute titans. They now held an unassailable fortune of $750 million, armed with the ultimate legal shield to protect it. They were entirely untouchable. Yet the world outside this silent vault was never truly quiet. Down on the Oak Haven waterfront, an intoxicated deckhand from the private charter boat let slip a frantic, drunken whisper about the abandoned island, mentioning elite appraisers and staggering wealth. The rumor spread through the humid coastal air like a massive, uncontrollable wildfire, racing across the miles of dark water straight to the mainland. The scent of unimaginable wealth eventually reached a dark, desperate corner of the city. It reached Julian Thorne. Drowning in massive debt and heavily hunted by ruthless creditors, the bloodless son heard the impossible whispers about his discarded parents and the haunted island. His greedy, panicked mind immediately calculated a violent, desperate plan. He rented a high-speed motorized skiff, gripping the steering wheel with sweating, manicured hands, racing aggressively across the choppy gray water towards Blackwater Island, armed with the absolute lowest, most cowardly legal threat imaginable.
The high-speed motorized skiff violently slammed against the rotting wooden piers of Blackwater Island. Julian Thorne cut the heavy engine. The afternoon heat was a stifling 92 degrees Fahrenheit, making the thick coastal air feel like a suffocating wet blanket. He wore a heavily wrinkled designer suit, his silk tie hanging loosely around his sweating neck. He scrambled frantically onto the damp wooden planks. His expensive leather loafers immediately sank deep into the foul-smelling swamp mud. He pushed blindly through the dense thickets of sharp palmetto leaves, tearing his silk jacket, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He expected to find two frail, broken old people dying in a collapsed shack. He broke through the tree line. He stopped completely. The massive, pristine Cypress mansion towered before him. The heavy solar panels gleamed under the bright sun. The cleared yard spoke of immense physical labor, and the faint, steady hum of the diesel generator echoed softly through the clearing. Sitting calmly on a heavy oak chair on the wide front porch was his father. Silas wore heavily stained canvas trousers and a faded cotton shirt drenched in dark sweat. His large, calloused hands rested quietly on his knees. Clara sat beside him, her spine perfectly straight. Julian immediately adjusted his posture. He forced a pathetic, trembling smile onto his sweating face.
He jogged toward the heavy wooden stairs, intentionally dropping to his knees on the hard dirt, playing the absolute role of a broken, desperate son. "Mother!" Julian cried out in a loud, heavily manufactured voice, letting forced tears well up in his eyes. "Father!" Silas did not blink. He did not move a single muscle. "I've been utterly ruined," Julian sobbed loudly, his manicured hands gripping the heavy bottom step of the porch. "My business partners completely betrayed me, leaving me utterly bankrupt, drowning in millions of dollars of massive corporate debt, and facing total, absolute destruction. I was so scared. I made a terrible mistake leaving you both, but I am here now to protect you." Clara looked down at him. Her face remained a mask of pure, untouchable dignity. "I heard the wild rumors about this island," Julian continued desperately, his voice rising in an urgent, pleading whine. "You cannot handle the massive stress of managing property at your advanced age. Just sign the deed over to me right now. Let me manage this burden. Let me save our family name, and I promise I will finally take care of you both." Silas stared at his son. He saw the absolute greed burning behind the fake tears. When the old man simply remained silent, the pathetic mask of the desperate son instantly dissolved, entirely replaced by the cold, vicious sneer of a cornered predator. Julian stood up, violently brushing the thick dirt from his ruined designer trousers. He pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at his father's weathered face. "You listen to me, old man," Julian hissed viciously, his voice dripping with venom. "I still hold the legal power of attorney over both of your pathetic lives. If you do not immediately hand over the complete legal rights to this entire 12-acre island, I will personally drag you both into a federal courtroom. I will testify that you are completely mentally incompetent, totally unfit to manage a single penny, and I will force you into a locked state psychiatric ward for the rest of your miserable lives." It was the absolute, ultimate, cowardly threat. Karma descended like a heavy iron hammer. Silas did not flinch. The heavy oak door behind Silas swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Beatrice Vance stepped out onto the wide wooden porch. She wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, her silver hair pulled back tightly, holding a thick, heavy leather folder. She walked past Silas and looked down at the sweating, pathetic man standing in the mud. She possessed the cold, terrifying aura of an apex predator completely cornering its prey. "Julian Thorne," Beatrice spoke with absolute razor-sharp authority. She casually tossed a thick stack of heavily stamped legal papers down onto the wooden steps. "That is a certified, completely irrevocable court order from the federal judge of Oak Haven County," Beatrice stated coldly, her voice echoing sharply across the quiet swamp. "It completely nullifies your fraudulent power of attorney. Furthermore, exactly 3 hours ago, this entire property, including all submerged assets extending 3 miles into international waters, was legally transferred into an ironclad blind charitable trust." Julian stared blindly at the papers. "You have absolutely zero legal authority here," Beatrice continued relentlessly, delivering the final crushing blow. "You cannot touch a single penny of the $750 million in assets. You cannot touch a single ounce of gold. You cannot touch a single grain of sand. You are completely locked out of this empire forever." Julian's face drained of all color. He took a heavy, staggering step backward. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as the massive, heavy weight of his absolute failure crushed his chest. He opened his mouth to scream, to utter another pathetic threat, but Beatrice simply raised her hand. "I am not finished," she said softly. She pulled a second, thinner envelope from her leather folder. While you were violently threatening two elderly citizens, I was actively submitting a comprehensive legal dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It details your exact systematic embezzlement of $65,000, complete with forged bank signatures, illegal wire transfers, and undeniable elder financial abuse." A loud engine suddenly roared. Julian spun around violently. Cutting through the thick gray fog, a heavy, dark blue police interceptor boat rapidly approached the rotting wooden dock. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the hanging Spanish moss with a harsh, terrifying glare. 3 heavily armed police officers leapt onto the splintered wood, their boots thundering against the planks as they sprinted directly up the narrow dirt path toward the Cypress mansion. Julian completely collapsed. His legs gave out entirely, sending him crashing down into the filthy mud. He did not run, he did not fight. The absolute cowardice that defined his entire pathetic life paralyzed him completely. 2 heavy officers grabbed his arms, violently yanking him upward, while a 3rd officer slammed thick steel handcuffs around his soft, manicured wrists with a loud, absolute click. He was completely broken. As the officers began to drag the trembling, weeping man away, Clara finally stood up from her wooden chair. She walked slowly to the edge of the porch, looking down at the absolute pathetic ruin of the boy she had raised. "We used sweat and dignity to survive," Clara said calmly, her voice carrying the massive weight of a queen rendering final judgment, "while you simply chose this complete humiliation." Julian sobbed loudly, a pathetic broken sound that was quickly swallowed by the thick swamp air. The police officers dragged him roughly down the overgrown path, tossing him carelessly into the back of the heavy steel boat. The powerful engines roared loudly, tearing through the water, taking the treacherous son away to face decades behind thick concrete walls and heavy iron bars. The air cleared completely. The traitor was removed in absolute complete disgrace, returning the deep, profound silence to the isolated island, a peaceful sanctuary where Silas now prepared to use his massive, unassailable fortune to execute one final, incredibly grand mission.
The massive wealth did not change their quiet souls. Silas and Clara did not purchase heavily armored luxury cars. They did not buy sprawling penthouses in the sprawling city, and they absolutely refused to acquire private corporate jets. Instead, they authorized Beatrice to slowly, methodically auction off the ancient gold doubloons and the heavy platinum jewels to elite private museums across the globe. They poured every single dollar directly back into the 12 acres of Blackwater Island, transforming the untamed wilderness into an absolute masterpiece of human compassion. They built a sanctuary. 2 years later, the heavy Cypress mansion was no longer a lonely, isolated fortress. The island had been completely reborn as the Oak Haven Sanctuary, a massive, beautifully designed haven created explicitly for elderly citizens who had been violently financially abused, utterly discarded, and entirely forgotten by their own flesh and blood. Wide, perfectly paved walking paths wound smoothly through the dense coastal oaks, leading to beautifully constructed wooden residential cabins, a state-of-the-art medical clinic, and vast, open therapeutic gardens stretching for hundreds of yards. The air smelled of fresh pine and blooming jasmine. Silas was now 78 years old. He sat quietly in his heavy wooden rocking chair on the wide front porch, his broad shoulders relaxed, the brutal South Carolina heat now a gentle 72-degree Fahrenheit evening breeze. Clara sat beside him, her 75-year-old face glowing with a profound, unbreakable peace. They watched the late afternoon sun dip slowly toward the western horizon, casting a brilliant, warm golden light across the tranquil marshland.
The island was truly alive. Down by the cleared shoreline, a group of elderly men and women, people who had once been thrown onto the unforgiving streets with absolutely nothing, were now smiling brightly. They harvested fresh tomatoes from the deep soil, sanded beautiful oak furniture in the massive new carpentry shop, and quietly reclaimed the human dignity that had been so viciously stolen from them. They were no longer victims waiting to die in cold, sterile rooms. They were finally safe. Silas reached out, his heavy, scarred fingers gently intertwining with Clara's soft hand. He looked into her eyes, seeing the absolute reflection of a lifetime of grueling sacrifice, silent endurance, and ultimate, undeniable victory. His chest swelled with a deep, quiet pride that required absolutely no validation from the outside world. "We built a very good ship, Clara," Silas murmured softly, his deep voice carrying the resonance of absolute, eternal freedom. "The absolute best," she replied warmly, leaning her head against his steady shoulder. From 19 crumpled, pathetic dollars and the absolute lowest depths of human cruelty inflicted by their own flesh and blood, the two stoic elders had forged a living testament to a profound, undeniable truth. Cruelty is ultimately fragile. Wicked men can absolutely drain your bank accounts, they can strip away your physical comforts, and they can violently hurl you into the darkest, most terrifying abyss imaginable. But they can never, under any circumstances, steal the quiet, monumental power of a deeply patient, hard-working soul. The universe keeps an absolute, unforgiving ledger. And the greatest and most unimaginably beautiful reward of an entire lifetime is almost always buried deep within the silent, grueling struggles, exactly where the arrogant and the greedy merely sneered and walked away.